Somewhere in Manhattan, there is a committee that has never advertised, never published a fee, and never told anyone what it is looking for. Today, I'm going to show you the actual written criteria of 3 institutions that decide who counts as old money, read from their own pages in their own words. And here is what none of them says. Not one mentions how much money you have. That is not an oversight. It is the design. We tend to you are either in it or you are not, and the ticket is a number in an account. But when you read what these places actually require, in writing, a different shape appears. There are doors behind doors. The criteria are not the same at each one, and the thing they measure is not the thing you have been told to accumulate. One of them requires one of them can be closed by a single anonymous vote. One of them holds a seat that only becomes available when someone dies. You will know exactly what each door asks for, and you will understand why the distance between the outermost of them and the innermost is wider than the distance between the outermost and you. Quick ask before we go further. If you want to understand how lasting wealth actually behaves, subscribe now. This is the kind of thing I go deep on every week. Let's start with the door most people have heard of and almost nobody has read. The Social Register is a book. It has been published since 1886, when a man named Lewis Keller had what its own history describes as the idea of consolidating the most important of these lists. Notice the wording. He did not create a list of important families. He gathered lists that already existed, scattered, and put them in one place. The hierarchy was already there. What he built was the index. Now, how does a family get into that index? The organization answers this itself on its own frequently asked questions page, and the answer is remarkably direct. Applicants are required to furnish letters of recommendation from several families already listed in the Social Register. Read that again slowly, on top of it. To be considered, you must first be vouched for by people who are already inside. Not one of them, several, which means the door cannot be approached from the outside at all. There is no form a stranger fills out alone. There is no amount you can wire that produces a letter. Before you are evaluated, you must already be known, and known well enough that multiple families are willing to attach their own names to yours in writing. And what do those letters contain? The organization tells you that too. They should contain information regarding family background and antecedents, names of parents, club affiliations, previous marriages if any, and any other particulars. Flush go through that list slowly. Family background, antecedents, parents, club affiliations, previous marriages. 5 categories, and every single one of them is about time. Where you came from, who produced you, which other doors have already opened for you, and what you have done with the commitments you made. Not one of them is about the size of anything you own. Then comes the last part, and it is the part that tells you what kind of system this really is. After the letters are submitted, the application goes to an advisory committee, and the insertion of the name is then dependent entirely upon its action. Not primarily, not largely, entirely. There is no appeal described. There is no scoring rubric published. There is no threshold you can hit that obligates a yes. A group of people whose names you do not know reads about your family and decides, and their decision is the whole of it. There is one more line on that page worth your attention, and it is easy to skim past. When people write in asking why they are no longer in the book, the organization explains that a name could have been omitted for a number of reasons, the most common being a lack of updated information. A lack of updated information. That means the listing is not a permanent award. It is a record that has to be maintained, by the family, continuously, forever. Nobody is coming to check whether you are still who you were. If the correspondence stops, the entry stops. Position here is not a thing you achieved once. It is a subscription to your own relevance, renewed by attention. And there is a story that circulates about the harder version of this, which I want to handle carefully rather than repeat as fact. The story goes that families have been dropped for marrying outside the circle. I could not find that criterion published anywhere by the institution itself. What is published is the line about updated information, and nothing about grounds for removal at all. So I will tell you what is documented and leave the rest where it belongs, which is in the category of things people say. But notice that even the documented version does real work. A boundary that requires continuous maintenance filters out everyone whose attention is elsewhere, which, over a few decades, is almost everyone. So that is the first door. It requires other people to open it for you, a committee to agree, and then it requires you to keep answering the mail for the rest of your life. Which sounds demanding until you look at the second one, where the entire process can be ended by one person who never has to say a word. In 1736, a club on St. James's Street in London wrote down its rules. They still exist, and they are startling in their economy. Withdrawing ones read as follows: that no one be admitted but by ballot, that nobody be proposed but when 12 members are present, that there be 12 members present when the person is balloted for, which is to be the day 7 nights after he is proposed. And 1 black ball is an exclusion for that time. That last clause is one of the most efficient pieces of social engineering ever committed to paper, and it is worth taking apart piece by piece. Inauguration just the mechanism itself. Members voted by dropping balls into a box. A white ball meant yes, a black ball meant no. The box concealed who dropped what. So the vote was secret, and it was physical, and it was binary. Now add the rule. 1 black ball is an exclusion, not a majority, not a third. 1. If 11 men want you in the room and 1 does not, you are not in the room. The 11 cannot outvote the 1. There is no debate, because nobody knows who objected. There is no case to answer, because no reason was ever given. The objection does not have to be defended, explained, or even remembered. This is the crucial thing, and it is why I wanted you to see the original wording rather than a summary of it. A system like this does not select for merit. It cannot. Merit requires comparison, and comparison requires discussion, and discussion is exactly what an anonymous single-ball veto eliminates. What a system like this selects for is something much narrower: the abtion. If no get in because someone champions you, you get holds a private reservation strong enough to reach into a box. Which means the qualifying trait is not excellence. It is being unobjectionable to every single person already inside, a completely different standard, and a far harder one to engineer on purpose. Now look at the timing rules, because they carry their own information. Nobody could be proposed unless 12 members were present. The ballot happened 7 nights later, and again required 12. So a candidacy took a week, needed a quorum twice, and gave every member 7 days to think, to ask around, to remember something. That week is not administrative. It is the point. It converts a decision into a period of consideration, and consideration is where quiet objections form. Is the final rule, the one I find hardest to forget: that no person be proposed or balloted for, but during the sitting of Parliament. The door only opened while Parliament was in session, not while the candidate was ready, not while the club was full. The admission calendar was bolted to the calendar of political power, which tells you, without anyone having to say it, what the room was actually for. There is a second-order effect here that I think is the most interesting thing about the whole arrangement, and it has nothing to do with the candidate. A rule like this does to the people already inside. If any a candidacy in silence, then every one of them holds a veto they never have to justify. And a veto you never have to justify is a strange kind of power, because it cannot be argued with, cannot be traded, and cannot be taken away. It also cannot be seen. Nobody in that room knows which of the others has ever used it. Are not only screening candidates, They are permanently, quietly screening each other's judgment without ever discussing it. That is a room where reputation is managed with enormous care, because the cost of being mildly objectionable is invisible, and the penalty arrives without notice. And now 12 members present to propose, 12 present to ballot. In a system where one ball decides, requiring 12 people in the room is not about legitimacy. It is about exposure. The more people who must be present, the more independent chances there are for a single private reservation to exist somewhere in the box. A rule that needed only 3 people present would admit far more candidates. 12 is not a formality, it is the filter. So the second door can be shut by one person for no stated reason, and only opens on the government's schedule. And the third door does not open on anyone's schedule at all. It opens when a seat becomes empty. In 1783, as the Revolutionary War ended, officers of the Continental Army founded a society. It still exists, and its membership rule is unlike anything else we have looked at. Here is how the organization describes who qualifies. Hereditary members are qualified male descendants of commissioned officers who served in the Continental Army or Navy, or of officers of the French Royal Forces who served in America during the Revolutionary War. Members are admitted to one of 14 constituent societies, representing the original 13 states and France, established in 1783. This is a lineage requirement, which is unusual but not shocking. Plenty of organizations ask about ancestry. The next rule that changes the nature of the thing entirely. Those constituent societies limit hereditary membership to one current member for each eligible officer. 1. Not one family, one person. I want to be precise here because precision is the whole job. The organization's own wording is most, not all. Some of the 14 societies operate differently, and the rules are controlled separately by each of them. I am not going to tell you it is universal, because the page I read does not say that. But in most of them, an ancestor who fought in that war produces exactly one membership at any given moment. Sit with what that means. It means the thing being inherited is not a status you share with your siblings. It is a chair. And a chair has a person in it. If your family qualifies through an officer, and your cousin currently holds that officer's place, you do not qualify by half. You do not qualify by waiting for a good year. There is no expansion of capacity when interest rises, because capacity is not a function of interest. It is a function of how many officers served in a war that ended in 1783, a number that stopped changing before anyone alive was born. And the service requirement itself was specific. The founding document provided for the admission of commissioned officers who had served to the end of the war, and those who resigned with honor after a minimum of 3 years as a commissioned officer. 3 years or the whole way. That is the ancestor. That is the qualifying event, and it happened in the 1770s. 2 more details, because they change the picture. First is that this was never one organization making one decision. There are 14 constituent societies, 13 for the original states and 1 for France, and the rules of eligibility are controlled separately by each of them. So there is no single door here either. There are 14, they differ, and a family's answer depends on which state's society its officer belongs to. Think about that as an inheritance problem. 2 cousins descended from 2 different officers are not in the same position, not because one family did better, but because 2 organizations founded on the same day in 1783 wrote slightly different rules and never harmonized them. Second detail is the French one, and it is my favorite thing in this entire society. Officers of the French Royal Forces who served in America qualify too, which means a hereditary American institution, founded by revolutionaries against a monarchy, permanently reserved seats for officers of a king, because those men were there. That is not sentiment. It is the logic of the whole system showing itself. The qualifying event is what happened, not what anyone would have preferred to have happened. Once the criterion is a fact in the past, it stops being negotiable by anybody's values, including the founder's own. Here is what I want you to notice about all 3 doors so far. The social register asks other families to vouch for you. Whites asks that nobody object to you, and this society asks that a specific man made a specific decision in a specific decade, and that the chair he generated happens to be empty. Money opens none of them, not one. You cannot buy a letter of recommendation that means anything because its value comes from the reputation of the person signing it. You cannot buy the absence of an anonymous objection because you cannot find the objector, and you certainly cannot buy an ancestor. But there is something else these doors have in common, and it only becomes visible when you look at how they changed over time. Was not always national. For 58 years, it was something much stranger. Return to that book for a moment, because its publishing history contains a fact that almost nobody thinks about. 1918, according to the organization's own history, there were 18 annual social register volumes representing 26 cities. 18 books, 26 cities, one country. Not a national elite. That is 26 separate elites, each with its own volume, each maintained locally, each answering to its own advisory process. Being at the top in Philadelphia did not place you in the Boston book. Standing in Baltimore did not travel to Chicago. The hierarchy existed, and it was real, and it was municipal. Think what that implies about the nature of the thing. If status were simply a measure of wealth, it would have been portable from the beginning, because money is portable. A fortune in Philadelphia is a fortune in Boston. But the book was not portable, which means what the book was tracking was not the fortune, it was the relationships. And relationships in 1918 did not survive a move. Those individual city books were published annually until 1976, when they were consolidated into a single definitive book. 1976. That is the year an American social hierarchy stopped being a set of local arrangements and became one national list. 58 years, from 1918 to 1976, of separate volumes, and then one. Does that single book hold now? Almost 25,000 entries in the winter edition. Now, I want to be careful here, and I want you to see me being careful, because this is exactly where these videos usually go wrong. You will find other numbers for the size of this book in other decades. Some of them are much larger. It is tempting to line them up next to 25,000 and announce a percentage, to say the list has shrunk by some dramatic figure and let you draw a conclusion from it. I am not going to do that, because the numbers do not count the same thing. One counts entries, another counts families. An entry and a family are not the same unit, and building arithmetic across two different units produces a result that looks precise and means nothing. So here is the honest version, and it is still remarkable. This is an institution that began by gathering scattered lists in 1886. It grew into 18 volumes across 26 cities. It consolidated into one book in 1976. And today, in a country of hundreds of millions of people, that one book holds a number of entries you could fit into a large sports arena. I want to stay on 1976 for a moment, because something happened in that year that nobody involved would have described in these terms. Up to that point, if you moved cities, you left the book. Not as a punishment, simply as a fact of how the volumes worked. Your standing was tied to a place, and the place did not travel with you. Which means that for 58 years, American social position had the same property as a house: valuable, real, and immovable. Consolidation changed the asset class. One book means position becomes portable. It can now follow a family across the country, survive a relocation, and stay intact through the exact kind of move that used to erase it. And here's the part I find genuinely surprising. Making the thing portable did not make it bigger. A national list is available to a whole country, not to 26 cities, and the number of entries today is smaller than the numbers people cite for the era of separate volumes. Whatever the exact figures, the direction is not the one you would expect from a market that just opened up. That tells you something about what is being tracked. If it were reputation for wealth, a national list in a far richer country would be far longer. It is not, which is consistent with everything else we have read. The constraint was never the supply of rich families. The constraint is the number of people willing to write letters about you. Which brings us to the question you have probably been forming for the last several minutes. If none of these doors ask about money, and they demonstrably do not, then what exactly is it that they are measuring? Let us lay the three sets of criteria side by side and read only what is actually written. The social register wants letters from families already listed, containing background, antecedents, parents, club affiliations, and previous marriages, and it wants a committee to approve. Whites wanted a ballot, 12 members present, 7 nights of consideration, and no blackball. The Society of the Cincinnati wants dissent from a commissioned officer who served 3 years or to the end of the war, and, in most of its societies, an empty chair. 3 sets of requirements. Not one figure of money anywhere in any of them. Look at what the categories have in common. Antecedents, parents, prior marriages, club affiliations, descent from a named man, 7 nights of reflection, a chair that must be vacated. Every one of those is a measurement of time, not duration in the abstract, specific, verifiable, elapsed time tied to people who can be named. And that reframes one asset that cannot be acquired quickly by definition. That is not a poetic observation, it is a structural one. A person who earns an enormous amount this year has an enormous amount this year. A family that has been vouched for by other listed families has something that required those other families to exist first, to be listed first, and to know them long enough to write about their antecedents. This is why the doors feel arbitrary from outside and feel obvious from inside. From outside, the criteria look like snobbery dressed up as procedure. From inside, they are simply descriptions of what everyone in the room already has. And there is a reason time works as a filter that money cannot replicate, which is worth making explicit rather than leaving as an impression. Money is a stock. It can be moved, borrowed, concentrated, and produced quickly by a single good decision. Anything a fortune can buy, a larger fortune can buy faster. So any criterion denominated in money is, by construction, a criterion that can be met by acceleration. Elapsed time cannot be accelerated by anyone at any price, ever. That is not a moral claim about patience. It is arithmetic. A relationship that is 20 years old requires 20 years, and there is no version of the transaction where a wealthier person gets it in 12. Which means that a boundary made of time is the only kind of boundary that a very rich outsider cannot solve. Everything else in the world yields to enough capital. This does not. And an institution that wants to remain what it is, rather than becoming a reflection of whoever currently has the most, will discover, sooner or later, that time is the only material it can build a wall out of. As far as I can tell, Ever wrote that down as a strategy. They did not have to. Boundaries built from anything else got bought, and the ones built from time are the ones still standing 300 years later to be read. And now I can answer the question I opened with. Why the distance between the outermost door and the innermost one is wider than the distance between the outermost door and you. The doors are not measuring the same quantity at different levels. They are measuring different quantities entirely. The first asks, do people vouch for you? That is a question about the present. It can be answered by a family that arrived 1 generation ago and made itself known. The second asks, does anyone object to you? That is a question about accumulated impression. It requires a room full of people to have formed no reservation, which takes years of being visible without being a problem. The third asks, did your ancestor serve as a commissioned officer before 1783, and is his chair empty? That is not a question you can influence at all. Not with effort, not with time, not with 100 years of impeccable behavior. It was settled before the country had a constitution. So the outermost door tests what you have built. The innermost tests something that stopped being buildable 2.5 centuries ago. A person can cross the first with a career. Nobody crosses the last with anything. Which raises the obvious question. If these boundaries are that rigid, how long does a family's position actually last? Somebody tried to measure that. The number is stranger than you would guess. One more ask, and then we get to the part that surprised me most. If you have made it this far, you are exactly who this channel is built for. Subscribe, and I will keep bringing you the machinery behind lasting wealth. An economist named Gregory Clark took a different approach to this question. Instead of following incomes across 2 or 3 generations, which is how social mobility is usually studied, he followed surnames, rare ones, the kind you can track through centuries of records. Method is elegant. Identify surnames that were overrepresented among an elite a long time ago. Then check how overrepresented those same surnames are among elites much later. The gap between the two tells you how quickly status regresses toward the average. Conventional studies had produced a fairly comfortable answer. Status fades. A family's advantage gets diluted across generations, and by the 3rd or 4th, the arithmetic of averages has done its work. Clark's surname measurements produce something different. In his estimate, the implied rate of intergenerational persistence falls in the range of 0.75 to 0.8. Let me translate that into plain terms, because the decimal hides what it means. A persistence rate near 0.8 means that in each generation, a family retains roughly 4/5 of its distance from the average. Not half, 4/5. And the distance carries forward from wherever the previous generation left off. Run that forward, and the implication is uncomfortable. Under those numbers, a family's advantage does not wash out in 3 generations. It thins slowly over a span measured in centuries, the kind of timescale where the great-grandchildren of the great-grandchildren are still measurably above the middle. And Clark did not find this in one place. According to the review I read, his principal analysis covered Sweden, the United States, and the United Kingdom, with extended analysis reaching India, China, Chile, and Japan. Different legal systems, different revolutions, different tax regimes, similar persistence. Pause on Sweden for a second, because it is the case that makes the finding hard to wave away. Sweden is the country people reach for when they want an example of a society that deliberately flattened itself. Heavy redistribution, universal schooling, a long political commitment to equality of outcome. If institutional advantage were going to wash out anywhere, it would wash out there. Does the surname method see something that ordinary studies miss? Because of what each one measures. A conventional study follows fathers and sons, and a single father and son pair is noisy. A man can have a bad decade. A son can pick an unusual career. Measure enough of that noise and status looks like it scatters quickly. Surnames over a whole extended group, across many more generations, which strips the noise out and leaves whatever slow signal is underneath. And the slow signal, in Clark's estimate, barely moves. The uncomfortable version of that is simple. The reason mobility looks reasonably fast in the usual statistics may be that the usual statistics are measuring individual luck and mistaking it for movement. Luck moves people up and down constantly. It just does not move families very far, and it does not keep them there. Now, if I wanted to make this video feel profound and end it here, this is exactly where I would stop. The doors are sealed. The measurement says 4/5 per generation. Position is essentially permanent. The numbers prove it. Roll credits. But that would be dishonest, because that is not where the evidence actually stands. Clark's conclusion is contested, seriously contested, by people who read the same data. According that the strongest objection persistence, it is something far more interesting than that. It points directly at everything we spent the first 30 minutes of this video reading. Here is the objection, and it is the reason this video exists in the form it does. The academic review I read makes 2 criticisms. The first is about scope. Clark's approach focuses on the transmission of professional or educational attainment among elite families, rather than income transmission for a nationally representative sample. In other words, he is measuring something narrower than social mobility, as most people mean it. and generalizing may not hold. That one is technical. It is the second one that matters. The reviewer argues that Clark is too quick to dismiss the various institutional mechanisms through which class is transmitted, that he gives insufficient weight to the social, cultural, and legal institutions that maintain elite status. Read that again with everything you now know. The objection to a near permanent persistence rate is not that families are more mobile than he claims. The objection is about the cause. Clark's framing invites you to see persistence as something almost inherent to families, as though status were a property carried in the line itself. And the critic answers, no. Look at the institutions. They are doing the work. Which institutions? A book that families already listed. A ballot where one anonymous blackball ends a candidacy with no reason given. A society where dissent from a specific officer produces exactly one chair and it stays occupied. A committee whose decision is entirely its own. This is the turn, and I want to state it as plainly as I can. It is not genetic destiny, and it is not some unexplained gravity in bloodlines. It is manufactured, deliberately, by mechanisms that were written down, published, and are still readable today by anyone who looks, including you 10 minutes ago in this video. A boundary maintained by people who are already inside will hold for centuries, because every new admission requires the consent of the people whose position that admission dilutes. That is not a mystery. That is a design specification. And if you build a door that way, a high persistence rate is not a finding. It is the expected output. And this is where the two readings diverge in a way that actually matters to you. If persistence is inherent, then the hierarchy is a fact of nature, and nothing about it is worth studying. You look at the doors, you note that they are closed, and you go home. If persistence is institutional, then it is made of rules. Rules have authors. Rules were adopted on dates, for reasons, and every one of them can be read. The rules of whites are from 1736, and I just read them to you. The Cincinnati's qualifying event is from the 1770s. The Social Register's committee process is published on a page that is open right now. None of that is hidden. All of it is procedure. And procedure is a completely different kind of obstacle than fate. Not because you can walk through it, but because you can finally see what it is made of. I want to be fair to Clark before we leave him, because dismissing him would be as lazy as accepting him. Is not in dispute in the way people sometimes imply. The critic I read does not claim the numbers are fabricated or the persistence imaginary. The claim is that his sample is narrower than the conclusion he draws from it, and that he underweights the institutions. Those are arguments about interpretation and scope, not about whether elite families stay elite for a very long time. On that, the evidence he assembled is genuinely striking, and pretending otherwise to make a tidier video would be its own kind of dishonesty. So hold both. Status persists at a rate that surprised the field, and a serious reader of the same work says the machinery doing the persisting is institutional, written, dated, and readable. So two statements do not fight. Together, they describe something quite specific, not a natural law, and not a conspiracy either. A set of ordinary organizations, each following rules that seemed reasonable to the people who wrote them, producing between them an outcome that lasts centuries, and that nobody in particular designed. That is how most durable things in the world actually work, not by anyone's grand plan, but by a lot of small rules pointing the same direction for a very long time, which is also, as it happens, a decent description of how a family fortune survives. So let me bring this back to you, and to the money you actually handle. The temptation with a video like this is to hear it as a story about exclusion, feel the sting, and take away the wrong lesson, that the game is rigged, so effort is theater, that reading is comfortable and it is useless, and I do not think it is what the evidence says. Here is what I think the evidence says. Every one of those doors measures elapsed, very aware that you may not get accountable and gauge. Those instantly and into a round with if you have been parently introduced, that makes sure that you may nothing help. Those two biggers face, which is local product and minimers. The two biggers face a gauge that you may have to do. Every one of those doors measures honored or not. Club affiliations already held. An ancestor's service. 7 nights of consideration. They are all the same question in different costumes. What has this family already sustained? You cannot join their institutions, but you can notice which question they think is worth asking, because it is a question about your own money that almost nobody asks. Not how much you have, but you can join their institutions. Not how much you have, which is the years of the extra officer. Not how much you are allow, but you can notice which question about your own money that almost nobody asks. Look honestly at your own financial life through that lens, and it gets uncomfortable fast. How many of your commitments are older than 3 years? How many of your accounts have survived a bad year without being rearranged? When something you owned stopped being exciting, did it survive that, or did it get replaced by the next interesting thing? Those institutions are, in their own strange way, testing for exactly that. Not virtue, not intelligence. Durability under time, the capacity to still be there later. And that test is available to you today, without a committee, without a letter, without an ancestor. Not because it puts you in the room. It does not, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But because the trait the room is screening for turns out to be a real trait, and it does something for a family whether or not anyone ever writes it into a book. The second thing I would take from this is smaller and more practical. When you next hear that something is simply how the world is, that some group stays on top because of some quality they have, go looking for the written rules. In this case, they exist. They were published in 1736 and 1886 and 1783, and they are readable in an afternoon. What looked like an unexplained fact about the world turned out to be a procedure with an author and a date. That habit generalizes far beyond old money. Most permanent-looking things are procedures that nobody bothered to read. And there is a third thing, which is the one I would actually want a family member to take from this. Every institution we looked at protects itself by making admission require the consent of the people who are already inside. That sounds like a mechanism for keeping others out, and it is, but watch what it does to the people within. If your position depends on other members vouching for you, then your incentives point permanently toward not embarrassing them. If a single silent objection can close a door, you behave, for decades, in a way that generates no private reservations in anyone. If your family holds one chair and only one, then whoever holds it is carrying something the whole line can lose. Those are constraints, and constraints, applied to money over a long enough period, do most of the work that people attribute to skill. I am not telling you to admire these places. Several of the rules we read are exclusionary in ways that are perfectly obvious, and were exclusionary on purpose. What I am telling you is narrower and more useful. The wealth survives partly because the people holding it are answerable to somebody, continuously, for a very long time. Most fortunes that vanish were never answerable to anyone at all. You can build that part yourself. Not the letters and not the ballot, but somebody who sees the decisions, and a standard you do not get to quietly rewrite when it becomes inconvenient. That is available today. It costs nothing, and it is doing more of the work in those institutions than any of the ancestry ever did. If this was useful to you, subscribe. It is the single thing that helps this channel most, and it costs you nothing. Next time, we go somewhere related and stranger. There is a legal instrument designed to outlive every person who signs it, controlling money for people who have not been born yet. And the families who use it well follow rules that sound almost superstitious until you understand what they are protecting against. That is where we go next. God bless you.